What is up, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Talk to Me. As always, I'm Joshua Toomey, and joined with me today is the host of the Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories podcast, Brian.
I'm so excited to be here, man. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, man. I'm glad you decided to come and hang out with us here at the mighty Louisville PopCon.
I will tell you, this is quite the event. Like, I didn't quite know what to expect, and I will say, if there is a PopCon in your city, go ahead and put it on your calendar, because this is huge. There are so many people here, and it's been a blast so far.
Yeah, I definitely walked in, and they have definitely taken me to the bank with my wallet is now much, much lighter after all these.
Yeah, but you're going to look great. You got tons of T-shirts with characters on it, and it's going to be great, man.
But yeah, looking through the crowd here, lots of faces. Like you said, man, much bigger than I expected, and they definitely put on a wonderful show here.
I know. I've got to figure out an escape route so I don't do what you did and spend all the money on the way out.
Just make sure that cash only.
Yeah.
But we decided to do a kind of a movie themed episode. Normally my episodes are more rock and metal based. I interview guys from like Metallica and Slayer and Megadeth and all that stuff. So since we're at the Louisville PopCon, we are going to do a snake draft of movie soundtracks, and we're going to go by decades. So 70s, 80s, 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s. And so I think we'll dive right into that. And since you're the esteemed guest, I will allow you to go first.
I get to go first in a draft? Normally there's some sort of arm wrestling, thumb wrestling, something that happens. You don't just give that up, but you're a gracious host. I appreciate that. So, it's funny because in preparing for this, one thing I was struck by is that, the way we think of pop cultural soundtracks doesn't really take off until the 80s. Right. There's some of it in the 70s. People will trace it back to The Graduate. That's the first soundtrack that has pop songs in it with, Simon and Garfunkel. But you really see this, and we'll talk about it when we get to the 80s. The 70s was I thought was kind of slim pickings unless you were going to straight up do the Star Wars soundtrack.
Right. That was the one thing I had trouble with on that was going into scores and
scores and musical soundtracks.
Right.
Right? There's a lot of great ones in the 70s. You could do Grease. You could do Rocky Horror Picture Show, which I considered. But I think what I'm going to take for my first pick for the 1970s for the soundtrack is Rock and Roll High School.
Okay.
Do you know this movie?
Yeah, I do, actually. It's on my list.
It's on your short list? Did I take it from you? Was it going to be your pick?
No. I'm glad you took that one. That could have been my second pick. But yeah, I think Rock and Roll High School definitely a contender.
Well, you've got the Ramones. But what I love about this story is that it wasn't always going to be the Ramones. So Roger Corman, the guy that makes this movie, he has this history of making drive-in movies in the 1950s. He had this company that would make these drive-in movies, and half the ones they would make would be High School Big Shot from 1959, T-Bird Gang from 1959, these short movies that would play before the main feature at a drive-in, or they put a whole bunch of them together, and they were all about high school in the 50s.
Right.
So he had this, he gets to the end of the 70s, he's got a bigger budget, he's got this idea, he sees this script, he wants to do a high school movie. And so originally they didn't know what style of music they were going to make it about. It was originally Disco High.
Okay.
It's a very different movie.
Sounds right.
Very different movie. Then they were going to make it Heavy Metal High School or something similar to that. Heavy Metal Kids, I think, was going to be the name of it. Eventually, they land on rock and roll, but they try to get Cheap Trick.
Okay.
And Cheap Trick tells them no. Then they try to get Todd Rundgren. Todd Rundgren tells them no. They've got this guy cast in the movie named Paul Bartle, and Paul Bartle is like, have you heard about this band who's just this band called the Ramones? And they call the Ramones and get the Ramones to be in the movie. So it becomes a Ramones movie in a lot of ways, but it wasn't necessarily meant to be.
Okay.
And it's all during the period in which the Ramones are making the Phil Spector record.
Okay.
So I don't know if you remember this. We talked about this on our show, Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories, way back on episode 50. But the sessions on this record, it's called End of the Century, are insane because Phil Spector, pretty much certifiably insane, right? and there's this whole story of him holding guys in the Ramones at gunpoint to do extra takes, imagine that pressure. I know you've recorded in a recording studio before. Have you been under that sort of pressure?
Not that kind of pressure, but I could definitely see Ross Robinson doing that to Slipknot at some point. Yes,
just try to amp up the energy, right? But it eventually Rock and Roll High School will be on End of the Century. So these two things are happening together. End of the Century itself as a record is not fantastic. So I would say take the Rock and Roll High School soundtrack, because that way you get not only a couple of good Ramones tracks, but you get Nick Lowe, Brian Eno, Todd Rundgren, who's not in the movie, Brownsville Station, of course, Smoking in the Boys' Room, any movie about high school from that period. So that's my pick, Rock and Roll High School.
That's a nice pick. Nice pick. My pick in the 70s it's honestly the first soundtrack that came to mind when we talked about this, and it's going to be easy. It's Saturday Night Fever.
Oh, okay.
And kind of when we talked earlier about how soundtracks didn't kind of come into play until 80s, 90s, I think this is one of the first.
Yeah, no, you're right.
That blew up the genre of hey, let's make some money off the record with the album. I mean, just for a fifth of Beethoven, you got to go with Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. But yeah, I mean, Staying Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, More Than a Woman. I mean, you can't go wrong with it.
So how often do you listen to the Bee Gees?
Not as often as you would think, but but enough.
Maybe more often than I would think is what I think it might be happening.
But yeah, the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, 1977, obviously John Travolta classic. Over the years, I mean, that's definitely kind of made it into the rotation, I guess. And I definitely had this on vinyl at some point, and it's just a good time. Good times had by all with the old Saturday Night Fever soundtrack.
Oh, that's okay. That's a good pick. So Rock and Roll High School versus Saturday Night Fever. What did we miss in the 70s that we should throw in honorable mention for the decade before you get the next pick in the snake draft?
A couple things on the 70s I had written down was the Buddy Holly story, because Gary Busey actually sang those songs.
Oh yeah,
on the soundtrack. I thought that was kind of a cool story. Rocky, yeah, you can't go wrong with some Eye of the Tiger.
Okay, but Eye of the Tiger not in Rocky 1. So this got me. This got me when I was doing the research, right?
Okay.
Because this is the thing people forget. And it's so weird. I don't think most people remember this. This is kind of lost to history. Rocky 1 and 2 sans Eye of the Tiger. It doesn't happen until Rocky 3, and it happens in Rocky 3 because he tries to get Another One Bites the Dust.
Okay.
And can't get it cleared. And so he's out to dinner with his buddies who own this record label, and they've got this band, this fledgling band called Survivor that they cannot get to work. They've had 2 albums that are failing.
Yeah.
I think one charted at like 180 and one charted at like 87. Like they cannot get this band to happen. And Sylvester Stallone is complaining that he can't get Another One Bites the Dust, and they go, "Listen, man, maybe we can help each other out here. What if we get one of our bands and they can make this song?" So he sends them the movie before it's done, and they actually do the chord changes to the rhythm of the punches in one of the scenes. That's why it works, because they literally scored the punching, and that's Eye of the Tiger. Isn't that crazy? I thought that was a crazy story.
Maybe that makes more sense, because when I was looking at the Rocky soundtrack, I was just seeing all of the the score.
Right.
So
and that was the thing with so many 70s movies, scores. And the great scores. If we were doing scores, you got the Star Wars score is like maybe the greatest, right?
Off the chart. And the 70s also gave us a lot of blaxploitation films. So, I mean, you got Shaft in there.
Yeah, we probably should mention that.
You got some of that stuff in there. And then Tommy. I kind of threw Tommy.
This was part of my question. Does that count? Because we're going to have to answer this question in the 80s, too. If you make a musical movie with original music from a rock musician, does it count in the soundtrack conversation? I mean, we're making the rules for this game, so we can do whatever we want.
I think it does.
Okay.
And, so... was Rocky Horror in the 70s, I believe?
Yeah. So that was
on the list.
That was one of the I had on my list too. Was you had these musicals, Grease, very different musicals, but very huge impact in pop culture, right? Yeah. Grease, Rocky Horror, and the Muppet movie. And the Muppet movie's got killer songs, dude.
Right.
I mean, Rainbow Connection, one of the all timers. But were you a Rocky Horror guy? Did you ever go to the screenings and throw toasts and stuff?
I went to one Rocky Horror, midnight showing, I think in Chicago. As a spectator, I did not participate. But it made the viewing a little bit more enjoyable. Not the greatest movie of all time, but a lot of fun had by all.
Do you realize that the guy that brought us Rocky Horror, saw it and kind of pushed it into the mainstream, is the same guy who brought us Carole King? Okay. That's a diverse resume. Lou Adler's like, I got 2 contributions:
Right.
Carol frickin' King and Rocky Horror Picture Show. He gets the American rights because they're doing it overseas, but he makes it much more rock and roll. And fun fact about that movie: the makeup. I'm just looking for the rock and roll tie-ins. The makeup is the same makeup artist that does David Bowie's makeup during that period.
Nice. Just when I thought I knew way too many useless musical facts.
You invited me just to even it out. You're welcome. You're welcome.
All right. Well, since we're doing a snake draft style, I get the first pick of the 80s. And my pick is actually might not even be on your list, but it's a movie near and dear to my heart. It was only available on VHS for the longest time. It was a movie that every Friday night when my dad took me to the movie rental place and said, hey, pick out a couple of movies, I rented it every week for like my childhood.
Oh, you're building this up, and I'm very excited to know what this is.
And then the best part is years later, my dad loves to buy movies. Like if you see his house now, looks like a Blockbuster exploded in the house. In the 90s, like he had full on movie shelves and built into the he was all about it. So he would go around to the local movie stores that were closing down, and he would buy used movies. So I was like, hey, if you ever see this movie out, you have to buy it. So he bought it from a totally different movie store, gets it home, gives it to me. I look at the side of it. It's the copy that I rented as a kid.
No way!
Over and over and over.
Hey, what movie is it?
The movie is Rad. There we go. We got one Rad guy.
Well, we've got another Rad fan in the house. Okay, so this came across when I was looking. It's not on my list, but when I was looking at movies from this period, this one pops up when, you guys like us are talking about movies. So remind me of the plot of this movie.
Ooh, the plot of this movie.
Why did you like it so much?
Well, it's a great movie.
It's not a real answer, man.
It's truly just kind of the coming of age. It's about a kid who is a local kid, and the touring BMX series is coming to town.
Oh.
And he's the local kid, and he's like everybody knows he's the bicycle guy.
Okay.
And the whole town goes to this meeting with the makers of Hell Track, which is this race coming to town, and they all put their feet down and they're like, we have to have Crew Jones in the race, or we don't want it in our local town with our without our local boys taking part in this race. So finally they, through all the rigmarole, they get him into the race, and you know what? He wins the race. I don't want to spoil alert from a 40-year-old movie, but he does pull through, and at the end, he beats Bart Taylor in the race. And,
the best part is that you acted like it was going to be hard for you to tell me the plot, and then you used all the character names. So clearly, you have legitimately watched this movie more than maybe any other movie. Yeah.
A young Lori Loughlin in this movie.
Oh, right on.
Looking, what's his name? Christian. Bart Connor is he was a U.S. Olympian. He plays Bart Taylor. What? I'm sorry, gymnast. Same thing, lady from the crowd. But going into the soundtrack, it is an...
Yeah, I was going to say, we haven't even gotten to what's on the soundtrack. Hit me.
Soundtrack-wise, Break the Ice, which John Farnham, Get Strange. I mean, it's not necessarily like these go-to tracks, but when I put the album on at the house, like it takes me back to childhood, takes me back to the movie, and makes me want to bust out a BMX in the front yard and go jump off some stuff. So
this is beautiful. I feel like I'm getting to know you so well. So let's pause for a second on this act of going to the movie store with your dad.
Okay.
Like that was the best.
Oh yeah.
And I would wait all week. My movie of that caliber was Dick Tracy. Like I remember,
Angel was the big hit on that.
Oh, Send Me an Angel. Right on. Okay, so I remember also and this I was explaining this to kids recently, that there used to be in certain grocery stores in small towns, there would be like a video rental section.
Oh, yeah.
You'd go like, hey, I gotta go pick up, the frozen pizza, and we'll pump up the volume,
Right, well, I mean, growing up where I grew up, I mean, it was at the gas station. Like the gas station had a section of movies, so So yeah, you
Yes.
would go and pick out, hopefully get the new release if they had them, and then obviously as movie rental became bigger and bigger, obviously the Hollywood videos, the blockbusters,
Right.
and all that stuff would kind of come along later. But yeah, man, as a kid, we would, if it wasn't at this gas station, maybe it was at the next gas station. The movie you wanted to see that night.
Dude, have you ever thought about, like, if you got a time machine and you could go back and see yourself at like age 7 and be like, hey, little Josh, I just want to tell you that when you're in your 40s, you're going to be able to pull up any movie or any song you want on a tiny device that you walk around in your pocket. I would literally be like, nah, there's no way. I might as well live on Mars at that point.
We literally were on our way here, and your text came up on the screen in the car. It said, "Would you like to reply?" I said yes. I spoke to the car, and it texted you back. And I looked at my wife and said, "We are in the future."
That's some Back to the Future stuff for sure. Okay, that's a great pick for the 80s. The thing about the 80s to me is that there's so many great songs, but a lot of times the soundtracks don't necessarily hold up, right? So we talked about Eye of the Tiger. We talked about, there's other stuff like Danger. Top Gun's got a bunch of one-off songs that are really good. You've got a whole bunch of stuff. Don't You Forget About Me, Simple Minds from The Breakfast Club. Like definitive moments. There's the "Oh Yeah" in Ferris Bueller, right? But it's not the whole soundtrack that you want. You want like the one song. So I was really looking for what are the soundtracks that there's like a whole and this is kind of similar to what you picked. Different vibe, kind of, but the music is probably closer, which is Repo Man.
Okay.
So Repo Man is a punk rock movie in a lot of ways. It's really about L.A., but in this movie you get, in the early 80s, Fear, Circle Jerks, The Plugs, and Black Flag. And we've talked about the Plugs of all of those, but we've talked about Black Flag on my show, but we've talked about the Plugs because the Plugs are part of one of my favorite moments in musical history, which is when Bob Dylan in the 80s goes on Letterman or goes on The Tonight Show and plays with a punk rock band. They play Joker Man. That punk rock band is the Plugs.
Okay.
And so the Plugs never get famous really on their own, but those guys individually will go on and work with some of the biggest names in music. And the other credit is like, also they were on the Repo Man soundtrack. So I would say Repo Man. I'm surprised you didn't say something that I thought was going to be, because when we were talking about doing this draft, you mentioned this movie, which is Less Than Zero.
Yeah, well, so honestly, that's not even on the
It's not on your short list?
even on the short list. But yeah, I mean, another great soundtrack.
Well, and it's based on Bret Easton Ellis' first novel. They really take the teeth out of the novel because Bret Easton Ellis is pretty hard to read if you've ever read him before. He'll write American Psycho and Rules of Attraction and tons of other stuff. But what makes this soundtrack so significant is who's involved in making it. So it's produced by Rick Rubin. Right. And this is 1986 Rick Rubin, so he's just come off of Resurrecting Aerosmith with Run DMC. Beastie Boys' License to Ill has just happened. And this soundtrack, and this is the other thing that I had forgotten about, is that in the peak period for movie soundtracks, there used to be singles from movie soundtracks. Like there's singles from rock albums, right? And so this is a great example of that, where you actually had the Simon & Garfunkel song Hazy Shade of Winter done by the Bangles. That becomes a pop hit.
Right.
And LL Cool J is Going Back to Cali is from the Less Than Zero soundtrack. It'll end up on his Walk with the Panther record, but first it's on this soundtrack.
And Less Than Zero also gave us the Inagata Devita by Slayer. So
yes, it did. I'm sorry I left that out. That's probably actually what we should have led with. Yeah, Slayer was involved. And that's like, 87, roll it back. Slayer's not super huge yet. That doesn't happen for a little longer.
Yeah, definitely a diverse soundtrack. The other ones I have written down, and you and I talked a little earlier, a movie that came out in '89, but I kind of think it's in the '90s, is Batman. Obviously.
Oh yeah, no, that's Burton's Batman is '89, right? Yeah.
Labyrinth, another good one. Purple Rain, obviously.
Okay.
Like you said, Top Gun. Another movie that I kind of more associate with my dad, but it's still kind of a fun time, is Eddie and the Cruisers. I enjoyed 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Eddie Lives. And then obviously the movie Heavy Metal. That's another good one.
Oh, right. So Heavy Metal, is probably should be a part of this conversation. Also, one thing that I thought about was how in the 80s you start to have this thing, a couple things happen. One of the reasons movie soundtracks take off is you start to have business conglomerates that own film studios and record labels.
Right.
And so they're using them to cross promote each other. So that's like the not the kind of unsexy reason that it starts to happen is business. People are making money. But a funny example of that is Fast Times. So people talk about Fast Times at Ridgemont High. If you go look at that soundtrack, it's like Jackson Browne and guys from the Eagles, like the least hip stuff for kids in the early 80s to be listening to. But it was all being, like, hey, we need to promote this record, so put it on this soundtrack for this young audience. And so you get some of that happening. But in the 80s, you have like two things happening in terms of what ends up on soundtracks. There's a lot of custom written songs for soundtracks. Another fun fact, Take My Breath Away, they put the sex scene in Top Gun into that movie for Take My Breath Away. Because once they got the song, they were like, this is great. We have to put this in the movie, and something good has to happen during it. That was the kind of power that was given to soundtracks at the time. But also you had the other side of that, which was guys who are now getting older and making movies about their childhood, and so they're soundtracked by songs from the 50s. So you have like The Big Chill, which was a big soundtrack for a lot of people at the time, but it was all songs from the 50s and 60s. And another example of that's Stand By Me, right? So filmmaker making a movie about his childhood has to be soundtrack time appropriate, so you get older songs, and Benny King's Stand By Me becomes a big hit again because of the movie. So does that lead us to the 90s?
That does lead us
It's my
to the
choice,
90s.
right?
Yeah, and you get first up.
And this was, we talked off mic. This was hard because of our ages.
Yeah, this was the one that I think I have the most.
I was going to say, you think I've had a lot to say about things so far. The honorable mention list is very, very long, and I kind of am not happy that I have the first pick because I can't decide which of these to take. I have 3 big choices and then a whole list of honorable mentions, and I can't decide which one. I think I'm going to take the one. So what have I done so far? Repo Man and Rock and Roll High School. I'm trying to think what makes like the best. There's several things that happen here that are important for rock history, right? One is a snapshot of what is to come in rock. One is a snapshot of what is happening currently. And I think I could tell that you know what I'm going to say, but I don't know if I want to take it or not. Are you going to take it if I don't take it?
I'm probably going to take it if you don't take it.
The question is, do I take Judgment Night or Singles?
Right.
I'm taking Singles.
Okay. Good.
I'll take Singles. Singles is can we have a filmmaker on our list more than once?
You can have it as many times as you want.
Okay, because this might not be the only time Cameron Crowe makes it on this list. I haven't decided yet. But this is the Cameron Crowe film from 1992, and I'm taking this because of Smashing Pumpkins' "Drown."
Okay.
It's the last song on the disc. It's 8 minutes long. It's actually before Siamese Dream. It comes out between Gish and Siamese Dream. And I got obsessed with this song years later. And I went and bought a copy of the Singles soundtrack somewhere so I would have it. And I got it was secondhand because, it's a bit 10 years later or whatever. And going back to the day of CDs. I put it in. I start Drown. I get like 2 minutes into Drown and it just starts to skip. And the bottom of that CD is totally fine, except right where Drown would be for the back half of the CD, there's a huge gash in it. And it was like this taunting where I was like, oh, I have it. I got it, finally. I no longer had it. It was, and so now, of course, I can go find 7 different versions of that song and listen to the 4-minute version or the 8-minute version or whatever. But it's also got my favorite Pearl Jam song, State of Love and Trust, is on that soundtrack first before it's on anything else. And it's like the first Paul Westerberg stuff after the Replacements. So, not that Rolling Stone gets to dictate what's good and not good, but they do consider this on their list of 50 greatest grunge albums of all time. And it's a great primer to learn about grunge and learn about that scene if you're learning about it in retrospect as well. So the single soundtrack, that'll be my choice for the 1990s.
All right, my pick for the 1990s, you said it, Judgment Night.
I could have had it.
Could have had it. Terrible movie. Did not go watch the
Singles
movie.
better than Judgment Night? I don't know. They're both very of a time. for sure.
I would probably say Singles is probably a better movie, but that's not saying much. Like, but when you go into the soundtrack, what they did with this soundtrack, obviously, is they took metal bands, rock bands, and they kind of paired them up with, hip hop artists at the time.
Yeah.
So just kind of going through it, Just Another Victim, Helmet, and House of Pain.
Yep.
Fallen, Teenage Fan Club, De La Soul. Me, Myself, and My Microphone, Living Color, and Run DMC. Title track, Biohazard and Onyx. The match made in heaven right there from not only this song, but they also did a cover of Slam together. It's great. The Slayer Ice-T stuff is kind of cool because a lot of the rock guys kind of went a little bit more hip-hop, but where on the Slayer medley, Ice-T just kind of came to Slayer, and they didn't really infuse too much hip-hop into that. Another Body Murdered, Faith No More, and Booyah Tribe. Definitely can't go wrong with that. I Love You, Mary Jane with Sonic Youth and Cypress Hill. Freak Mama, Mudhoney and Sir Mix-a-Lot. I like how Sir Mix-a-Lot kind of throws in, I'll throw you in the mud, honey, at some point in that song. Yeah, and then just, Pearl Jam, Cypress Hill, Therapy, and Fatal, and Dinosaur Jr. and Del the Funky Homo Sapien. But it's just one of those where you kind of said it earlier, where it's kind of what's about to come in music.
Yeah, I mean, it is a harbinger for what happens in the next 10 years.
Because
right?
this came out of, 93?
This is 93.
So Korn is 94.
Right.
Limp Bizkit is, 96, 97.
Yep.
Like Deftones, 95. You got so much stuff kind of coming that this kind of is a precursor to where you get the influence of both rock and rap together.
Well, and the great Lost track on Judgment Night is the Rage Against the Machine Tool collaboration.
Okay, yes.
So they do it together, and both decide they hate it.
Okay.
And so it never gets released, but you can find it. It has, in the age, in 2024, in the age of the internet, 30 years later, of course, it's floating out there, and you can find this Lost track. But the movie's also got a brief appearance from Everlast in it. Eric Francis Schrody, as his parents call him, the guy from House of Pain, who will go on to have the one big hit at the end of the 90s, What It's Like. He's in the movie briefly. And, yeah, I mean, we didn't even talk about who's in the movie, but you have Emilio Estevez, who's also in Repo Man, right? So, Emilio Estevez showing up, man, for the pod. Cuba Gooding Jr. is in this movie. Jeremy Piven, Steven Dorff. Like, it's a decent cast, but, yeah, it doesn't really hold up as a film. There are so many if we're going to do honorable mentions. So I told you I had 3 that I couldn't figure out which one I was going to take.
Okay.
So Singles, Judgment Night. The third one, it happened to me the other night because I went to see Everclear at the State Fair. And they were like, we're playing all these songs from soundtracks. And they played the song that they did for Scream 2, which super deep cut. And then they were like, we did this song, and it was on a soundtrack in 1995 called Romeo and Juliet.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, yeah, that soundtrack. I almost missed that soundtrack. So in 95, I was 12, and I have an older sister who was very into that adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, as is everybody was. I mean, it was a huge hit. And that soundtrack is garbage, Everclear. You've got the Butthole Surfers. You've got the Cardigans, Love Fool. I mean, that comes from that soundtrack. And then you've got Radiohead doing a song called Talk Show Host that has a very long legacy that Radiohead fans really love that song. And that's all from there. When I asked people about this period, though, or I said, hey, soundtracks, what are the best soundtracks? Anybody in my age range immediately said the Matrix soundtrack.
Okay.
How do you feel about that soundtrack? You remember that?
I don't remember. What's on the Matrix?
Manson, Propeller Heads, Ministry, Meat Beat Manifesto, Rob Zombie, Deftones. My Own Summer is on that soundtrack.
Nice.
Monster Magnet. You've got Rage, but this is a soundtrack that had a bunch of songs on it that weren't necessarily in the movie. There's this weird thing that happens where there's music from and inspired by the film, and you're like, nah, you mean the label wanted to put this on the record. It wasn't inspired by it. Nobody was walking around being like, I saw The Matrix and it made me write Wake Up. It's like, no, I don't think that's how that happens.
You've also got a few others kind of along the same lines of the Judgment Night soundtrack. The Spawn soundtrack.
Dude, I convinced my conservative parents to let me go see Spawn. I brought this up within the last week when I was talking about soundtracks with someone. I was like, dude, you know what I had to like run a whole scam on was getting to see Spawn in the theater. And they were like, my friend goes, and that movie does not hold up. Like, it is terrible. When was the last time you watched it?
Oh, I don't know if I've ever seen it. I know I own the soundtrack.
John Leguizamo is in so much makeup in that movie. But that comic book inspired movies, right?
Yeah.
With decent soundtracks. The Crow. We haven't mentioned that yet.
Crow's on here, yeah.
And that's really, like, that whole book is inspired by the Cure and Joy division. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing with The Crow, because it's very inspired by the music that then will soundtrack the movie. And I was really into the idea of the Crow soundtrack, even though I don't think I ever owned it or listened to it, because there was this band called For Love Not Lisa. Do you remember this band? Mm-hmm. So I was really into the band. The guy was in, Mike Lewis from For Love Not Lisa was in a band later called Puller that I really loved. And I remember hearing, oh, he was in this band called For Love Not Lisa. They were on the Crow soundtrack. So it always was huge in my mind for that reason. Yeah,
The Crow was big. Another big one was the Demon Knight soundtrack.
Oh.
That was the first time I ever heard Filter, because Hey Man Nice Shot was on that.
Oh.
That was the first time I ever heard the band Machine Head. That was they were on that soundtrack. That was a big one. Wayne's World is a big soundtrack.
Yeah.
Dazed and Confused.
Oh, yeah. Well, so Dazed and Confused is Linklater doing the thing from the 80s in the 90s, right? Where he's like, oh, now I'm reminiscing about the 70s. But, and you get Detroit Rock City in that same period, right? Like into the 90s. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, you see that in each decade where it's like you go back, there's a bunch of soundtracks that will resurrect songs from 20 years before because you have filmmakers reminiscing about their childhood.
Do you realize that if they were to make Dazed and Confused today, it would be set in like 2003? By the way.
Don't say that. Well, it's funny that you mentioned soundtracks as a way of discovering music. And that happened for me for sure on hearing new bands, but it also hearing old bands and discovering stuff. There's like a whole like Skeleton Key stuff that I did with, like, embarrassing as it is, I was 10 or 11 when Forrest Gump came out. And that soundtrack had Fortunate Son by CCR and like songs that I had just never been exposed to that I was obsessed with. Like, I remember thinking, like, this song's from the 60s? This CCR song? This is amazing. And so that was and then a movie that was really big in my house in 1995 was Mr. Holland's Opus. Did you ever see this movie?
Maybe.
Richard Dreyfuss plays a music teacher. My mom was a music teacher, so this was a big deal. And it also, very much like Forrest Gump, is mostly, like, it's about his career through several decades, and so it's soundtracked by music from throughout different decades. And it's the first time I heard The Pretender by Jackson Browne, which is one of my all-time favorite songs. The songwriting on it is amazing to me. And so those two, I didn't want to take them as my picks, but they're very important soundtracks to me. And then the last, we both have to talk about our T-shirts, because we're squarely in the 90s.
Yes.
So what my favorite movie of all time, probably, if you're going to just, for nostalgic reasons, if you're going to make me pick one, is Tom Hanks' 1997 directorial, I think it was his directorial debut. It's a movie called That Thing You Do, about a band, again, from another decade, from the 60s. And they are called The Wonders, and they spell it Oneders, and it's a running joke through the movie that doesn't make any, like, people will call them the Oneaters. So I have a novelty T-shirt that is the Ramones logo, but it says Wonders spelled with an O.
Oh yeah, that Thing You Do is a movie I've probably watched a million times. Like, there are so many little nuggets in there with the whole TB player.
I quote it all the time. Oh yeah, and you're a bass player.
Like it just, but then like the Wolfman shows up and he just rips on live TV, and then
dude, all the bass player jokes in that movie, man. I should have led with that. That's hilarious. Yeah, I love that movie. There's so many things I will say that come from that flick, and it's funny how many people, because it wasn't a commercial success at the time, it's lived on through VHS and DVD, and I think a lot of people have seen it now. But at the time, yeah, it was a moderate success, if that. But I will say things like, "Oh, I ain't with these boys. I got a pig over in the livestock competition, and I'm going to win that blue ribbon." Stuff, just dumb throwaway lines from that movie that really live on. I love that movie, and yeah, I can watch it over and over and over and never get tired of it.
I literally interviewed Levi from Miss May I like 2 weeks ago, and he was talking about how they signed their record deal with Rise Records, but that was when Rise was just two guys, and it was basically a MySpace message. And I literally said, I look at him, I was like, this guy brought us to his nice camper. We're signing.
I'm dying because as soon as you started the story, I knew where you were going. This guy is a very nice camper.
We're all signing.
We're all signing. Oh my God. And I guess maybe part of it is like rock guys of a certain age. Like, it's just like one of those movies. Like, I know Dazed and Confused is that way for some people, but yeah, I love it so much. And as an exercise in this, as people kept telling me when I would ask people in my general age bracket about movie soundtracks, they were all in the 90s, and they would, a lot of the same ones would come up. So I was like, oh, you know what? I was like, I have this piece of history in my house, which is the CD wallet that my wife had that she brought into the relationship 20 years ago when we got together. And I was like, I want to see what movie soundtracks she had in high school, because we've kept them all. We've not got rid of them. So I'm flipping through. Here's the list. You ready? 10 Things I Hate About You, Clueless, Romeo and Juliet, The Matrix, The Crow, City of Angels, and Basketball.
Okay.
Do you remember that soundtrack?
I don't remember the soundtrack. I watched the movie a million times. But...
The soundtrack's like Real Big Fish.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
And Nerve Herder, Super Suckers. It's like all these like cult and punk bands. Yeah. It's pretty good. The Clueless soundtrack has a bunch of there's a couple of different live performances from radio things, like the Counting Crows covering the Psychedelic Furs, like weird things that are on the Clueless soundtrack that are really, really good. And I found the first time you were talking about the first time you heard Filter, the first time I heard Jimmy Eat World was on the Never Been Kissed soundtrack.
Nice.
Lucky Denver Mint from Clarity was on that soundtrack.
To kind of wrap up the 90s, a couple of more things. The band Megadeth, they are essentially one of the greatest soundtrack bands of all time.
Okay, give me the list.
They were on Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey with the song Go to Hell.
Oh, yeah.
It was supposed to be the title track, but they changed. The studio didn't want to call the album Go to Hell. They're on the Last Action Hero soundtrack.
Oh, my God, dude, I love Last Action Hero. Justice for Last Action Hero.
We're going to... they are also on Beavis and Butthead.
Oh, Do America, yeah.
America. And, yeah, so, I mean, just like their contributions to soundtracks are amazing. A few more. We got to say it. We got to say Titanic.
Titanic
soundtrack.
You couldn't get away from the Titanic soundtrack. That is true.
Spice World.
Okay, I forgot about that. Yeah.
The Bodyguard.
Oh my God, my sister had The Bodyguard, and I would like steal it from her and put it in my Walkman when I did the dishes. So like whenever I hear Whitney Houston, I think about doing the dishes. You can take that as a double entendre if you want.
And then the kind of musical, is it a soundtrack, is it not, is Nightmare Before Christmas.
Oh, that's a good one. Man, so many good ones.
Yeah, the 90s were wild.
And then we did this and you said, oh man, when we get to the 2000s and the 2010s, that's where it's going to get difficult. I do agree. It was a little bit harder, though. 2000s, I didn't have too much trouble, but it was like everything was before 2005.
Well, if we don't hurry up, we might have to stop in the 2000s.
Okay, you've got, I've got lots of facts. You go ahead. What do you have in the 2000s?
All right, 2000s. And this one was like a last minute, oh yeah, I forgot about that soundtrack. So we were going to pull it up really quick. And then, and it's one of those, it's like music from and inspired by.
Uh-huh.
It's one of those deals. But the Freddy vs. Jason soundtrack, it's like a Roadrunner Records classic. You've got Kill Switch Engage, you've got Spine Chain, you've got Mushroom Head, you've got Hatebreed, Slipknot, Chimera, From Autumn to Ashes, Seven Dust, Power Man 5000. I mean, it is like 20 tracks of just of great stuff. So, I mean, that's just kind of where I went with this because I mean, there's a lot in the 2000s, but I was like, oh yeah, that Freddy vs. Jason soundtrack. That was basically a Roadrunner Records compilation.
So my question was, do I go in 2000s indie hipster? Do I go like the sort of pretentious cool guy route, or do I go totally dumb but great soundtrack that covered a whole bunch of Steely Dan songs? I'm gonna go pretentious cool guy, I think, and go with Vanilla Sky.
Okay.
Do you remember this soundtrack? So this is the second Cameron Crowe flick on my list, but this is the it ends up Paul McCartney wins an Academy Award, and it's got just an awesome bunch of songs on it. But it was the first time I ever heard Red House Painters, and You've got Josh Rouse on there. I think that might have been the first time I ever heard him. REM does a song. Radiohead does everything in its right place. Peter Gabriel, Salisbury Hill. The Monkees, they put the Porpoise by the Monkees in that movie. That movie's like a weird mind trip anyway. But I'm conflicted because the other ones I really wanted to do were Garden State, which feels a little bit twee looking backwards. Zach Braff basically picks all those songs. But he makes the Shins. And the most 2004 thing about Garden State, like really talking about the time period, is the song Orange Sky by Alexi Murdoch is in that movie, but not on the soundtrack. We've been talking about how that happens, right? And that's because the rights to the song were owned at the time by the OC. So it's like Zach Braff and the OC are fighting over your song. Welcome to 2004. But the Steely Dan cover record is Me, Myself, and Irene.
Oh, wow.
You remember that movie?
Yeah, great movie.
Yeah, the movie's ridiculous. I'm not sure it holds up like sort of cultural sensitivity-wise, but it is. It's got 16 songs on it, which again, a lot of movie soundtracks are really long, which is something that doesn't happen anymore. Half of those songs are Steely Dan covers done by people like Brian Setzer Orchestra, Ben Folds 5, Smash Mouth does Do It Again. And then you also just have other songs, like Third Eye Blind is on there. And the score is done by Pete Yorn, who's one of my all-time favorite singer-songwriters. And he doesn't have his debut record out yet. He gets this gig because his brothers work in Hollywood, and he's living with them. So his first gig is to soundtrack a Farrelly Brothers movie, or soundtrack it in part, but also score it. So I do have a real place for Me, Myself, and Irene.
All right, other 2000s movies. I think we will end on the 2000s. So one of my favorites is Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
So I felt weird not picking that, but I just don't really like. It's not something I like. But from a cultural standpoint, it brings bluegrass back in a major way. Like people are like, being from Kentucky, people are like, oh, bluegrass, this is great music. It's like, yeah, it's been in Kentucky for a long time, dude. Yeah, that was a huge. I think people forget how big Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Great movie.
How big it was.
8 Mile.
Again, is that cheating? I guess it's not cheating.
It's borderline. The Wrestler, very 80s soundtrack. Kind of got a lot of a lot of the glam, a lot of the hair metal in there.
Yeah.
Twilight.
That is in the 2000s,
I was
isn't
kind of
it?
wondering if you were talking earlier. Do I go like,
The Twilight soundtrack was really good. I mean, they all were really good. So, funny story, I have a 17-year-old daughter who asked me to take her to see Iron and Wine, and I was like, why do you want to see Iron? Oh, that's why. That's why. And that's what he's doing as the encore, is Flightless Bird, American Mouth.
Guardians of the Galaxy.
So people brought this up to me, and again, that's just like a nostalgia play, right? Yeah. But I mean, it's good. It's a good collection of songs.
School of Rock.
Oh man, I love School of Rock. But again, it's like songs made for the movie.
Yeah. Another one I got is Walk the Line.
Yeah.
I do love Johnny Cash, but I do love that Joaquin Phoenix actually does versions of Johnny Cash songs on that soundtrack.
Okay.
His version of Cocaine's really good, or whatever that song's called. But
yeah.
But yeah, I enjoy the movie. I enjoy his performance. I love that he actually did some of the songs, kind of like the Buddy Holly thing with Gary Busey. Going back, Queen of the Damned. That was kind of
I did have someone tell me when I was crowdsourcing this, Queen of the Damned needed to be on the list. That was, and they were like, oh, it's not 90s, it's 2000s. You can cheat. And I was like, oh, perfect. That's a killer one. There's some really good stuff on that for sure. Couple others that I had, we were talking about these where the ones that taught us about older music. Two of those from this period are High Fidelity and Royal Tenenbaums for me.
High Fidelity, great movie.
I loved that at the time. Again, I watch it now and I'm like, man, this guy whines a lot. Another movie that the movie was ridiculous. I'm not sure I ever saw it, but it had a great soundtrack. I worked in radio at the time, and we got the soundtrack. That's the only reason I know this. Like, it came in a CD and it was on someone's desk, and I was like, what is this? Just Like Heaven. It's based on a French novel, and it's got Reese Witherspoon and Mark Ruffalo in it. And most of the soundtrack, kind of like Me, Myself, and Irene, half of it is regular songs, and then half of it is covers. But they're like 60s and 70s songs. Khalees, Pete Yorn, Emerson Hart from Tonic doing Stone songs and Pretenders songs and stuff like that. And I've always really enjoyed that soundtrack.
I think that's going to do it. Well, the other one I have on here is another one of your favorite dudes is Almost Famous.
Oh yeah, Cameron Crowe. See how many okay, and that was the other thing when doing this. I was like, there's a lot of guys who could just be on this list every decade because they spend their whole career making music, like sort of like music adjacent movies, right? I mean, Cameron Crowe was married to Nancy Wilson for most of his adult life, so you have this deep connection to that. Yeah, the Almost Famous soundtrack is great.
All right, well, I think that will do it for our time up here at the Louisville PopCon. Thank you guys for hanging out with us today. And once again, I am Joshua Toomey. And let everybody know where they can find your show also.
Yeah, so my show's called Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories. You can find it anywhere where you download Talk to Me or anything else that you like to listen to. We're on Spotify, etc. Patreon, Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories. Instagram, Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories. YouTube, look up Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories. Come hang out with us.
So, yeah, that will do it for us. Once again, thank you guys. And, talk to me podcast, notfest.com. Thanks.